Hello and welcome to this video lecture, Part 1, Theology of Religions. And you're familiar by this point with our fair use guidelines, and thanks for abiding by these restrictions. Before we dive into the content of this particular installment of the video lecture, I want to offer you just an overview of this three-part series. So here in part 1, we're going to start with some review, and I'll be situating the theology of religions locus within the larger context of systematic theology, similar to what I've done in the most recent lecture series. And I'll sort of deepen our understanding of this situating of the locus by taking a look at a couple of important terms that are central to this aspect of our God talk. Then in part 2, we'll turn our attention to a few more key vocabulary concepts, but then I also want to give you data about the variety of religious expression that is part of our world today, and helps us to attend to the three tasks of theology of religion. Then in the third part of the video lecture series, I'll turn to highlight some important themes from Veli-Matti Karkkainen's book, An Introduction to Theology of Religions. And I want to do that to help give us a framework for how we think about how we participate. It'll be an ecumenical framing, hopefully, of how we as Christians participate in conversations about theology of religions. So, to the review. This first part of the review, you should be able to say this in your sleep now, reminds us of some guiding concepts. First, we are talking about theology as God talk, our speech about what we understand faith in God to mean. And then the other key concept, in addition to understanding theology as God talk, is understanding that to do theology well means we are conscious of our theological method. Now, I've been using this definition of theological method from Howard Stone and James Duke, and it has two dimensions to it. First, it describes the importance of having a process for doing theological reflection, which is why I've assigned Robert Knass's handy little Making Faith sense. And then the second part, or the second dimension of theological method, actually has three parts to it. This has to do with how we gather together the sources that we use to reflect and construct theological concepts, how we order those topics, and then the criteria we use for evaluating theological ideas and God talk. So, theological method is a procedure followed in the process of theological reflection, but it's also the study of the sources, the ordering of topics and materials, and the criteria for evaluating a theology. Now, within this, I've also been I teach Christian theology too as a systematic theologian. Now, systematic theology is, we can think about it as a genre or a style of theology that focuses our speech about what we understand faith in God to mean in a way that emphasizes comprehensiveness, coherence, and clarity. And I'm interested in, and I'm trying to impress upon you, the importance of being interested in comprehensive, coherent, and clear God talk, because it's a way of responding to the challenge we face in our time. As Robert King suggests, if there can be said to be a single overriding task for theology at the present time, it is to recover a sense of the wholeness, that is the unity and integrity of the Christian witness. So being comprehensive and being clear are two ways to do that. Now, systematic theology is also a genre or style of doing theology that organizes things by loci and or doctrine or themes. In Christian Theology 1 and Christian Theology 2, we are introducing you to 15 of these themes of systematic theology. 1 through 8 were focused on in Christian Theology 1. 9 through 15 are the focus for Christian Theology 2. We're at 14, we're in the home stretch. But we've also been working with reconstructing theology's fourfold definition of the theological task. Well, or let me back up and say, in answering the question, what is theology, Rebecca Chopp and Mark Taylor suggest that it is a language and knowledge about God that has four characteristics. One, it's critical and faithful. That is, we understand being critical and faithful as mutually inclusive dimensions of the theological task as Christians. It's historical and contextual. That's a way of recognizing that we receive from prior generations of Christians language and knowledge about God, and we seek to receive that gift from the past here in the present and offer it to future generations, recognizing that some of that content shifts and changes over time and in different places because it has to be contextualized. A third dimension of this language and knowledge about God is that it's organized around symbols and doctrine. And here, as we are on the cusp of Holy Week, I want you to be particularly attentive to the symbols and doctrines that get evoked as we remember the last days of Jesus' life before he was resurrected. And then fourthly, this language and knowledge that we have about God is developed as a form of communal praxis. So it's not just talking and it's not just doing or sort of living out the beliefs. It is bringing the doing and the saying together into something that becomes a whole that's greater than the sum of its individual parts. So that is to say, theology as a language and theology as knowledge about God is something that is embodied and lived. So with that piece of review under our belts, I want to now shift into what I call this methodological framing of the loci using my famous circles. And as I do that, I'm going to be looking at my notes here from time to time. And I will gladly post this page of notes along with the slides, since I think some of you will find that useful. So this first slide here, and there are going to be kind of three different sets of slides that have the relationship, that shift the relationship between the God circle and the us circle, or humans, in different relationships based on the loci that I'm commenting on and framing for us. So we start here with a big God circle and a small us circle. And this is a reflection on like the first stage of most systematic theology brings into focus themes like creation, a doctrine of creation, a doctrine of revelation, of salvation, that is soteriology, and a doctrine of the Trinity. These are loci that are interested in affirming and underscoring the fact that God, who creates, redeems, and sustains the cosmos, communicates with us. And this communication comes to us as an act of revelation. And the Bible contains this revelation, which is why it becomes holy. That is, it becomes not just biblical text, but scripture, sacred text. These communications cross the boundaries of God's infinite nature and our finite nature as an act of love. Right? God wants to be in relationship with us. And then Jesus Christ, who is the subject of our Christology, our Christ talk, is a particular communication of God's intention for the world. And in the incarnation, God in Jesus embraces opposites. The infinite becomes finite, right? God becomes human. As we think about pneumatology, then, too, we recognize that the Holy Spirit is the third leg or the third person of the Trinity, but has, for the most part, especially in Western Christian theology, been a kind of afterthought or almost a sort of byproduct of a necessary neglected part of God talk. Well, so with this next slide, you see I've shifted the size of the circles, but I've also shifted so that rather than Christology being the thing that bridges God and humans, pneumatology becomes a way of bridging the space between God and us. And this is because of the fact of chronology. We aren't living in first century Palestine, so we don't get to meet Jesus. We receive these stories, we receive this tradition about who he was as one of God's chosen people of the nation of Israel, or the people of Israel. And so we relate to God as spirit. this is the reason some argue that pneumatology needs to take a new and more prominent place in our theological reflection. So as we think about bringing pneumatology, our spirit talk, more to the fore of our theological reflection, what we do is we're considering the way spirit talk takes seriously the way God's breath animates our lives and makes us new, makes us in some way holy. That is, it is through the Spirit that God breathes and sanctifies. Now, the circle here representing us has become bigger because this represents the clustering of loci that I like to gather together under the umbrella of theological anthropology. So theological anthropology is the phrase that I use to gather together four loci. The first being doctrine of the human being that I've titled Imago Dei, of course this being the Latin phrase that affirms the biblical concept that we are made as human beings, we are made according to God's image and likeness, which makes us different among creation's creatures. We are housekeeping earth creatures, or earth keepers, who are stewards of earth made from earth. But we also have the capacity to undo creation. This is Melinda's theology of the nuclear bomb, which means we have the creativity and capacity to transcend our creatureliness. But this also means we have particular responsibility. So that for me, the doctrine of the human being is a way of capturing this identity of transcendent stewards. It goes hand in hand, though, with our doctrine of sin, or our hamartiology, with hamartia, of course, being the Greek word for sin from the New Testament, meaning to miss the mark. This names our broken and sinful identity, another ingredient of biblical theology and biblical faith, or theological anthropology. A third dimension of theological anthropology, and at least what I'm clustering under this rubric of theological anthropology, is theodicy, or our doctrine of the nature of evil and suffering. Theodicy actually has two meanings. Theodicy, on the one hand, is an argument that explains how or why God allows evil to exist, but it's also the term for the branch of God talk that seeks to offer persuasive justification for God's attributes in the face of evil and sin. That is, how can God be all-knowing, all-loving, or all-good, all-powerful, and ever-present, while allowing evil to exist and persist? With evil here referring to both human sin and human evils, so think genocide, think war, think murder, and then that's often contrasted with natural evils, things like the predatory instinct of most meat-eating creatures or natural disasters. A fourth dimension of theological anthropology then is discipleship, which we'll return to in a moment. Now I want to shift our circles, and so the us circle has grown, and the God circle has now we've lost some of those other loci, and it's now inclusive of the three persons of the Trinity, named as Creator, Christ, and Spirit. And where previously Christology had bridged the gap between God and us, and then pneumatology bridged the gap between God and us, I now want to identify ecclesiology as a point of connection between God and humans. Our ecclesiology, or our church talk, is an avenue for us to ponder how the triune God desires and inspires us to perform acts of praise, lament, solidarity, and service in the face of sin and struggle. Right? So that the nature of the church is to gather together to worship God, but also to recognize that there's a gap between the way the world is and how God intends for it to be. I've also introduced into our conversations here in Christian Theology 2, Mariology. Why should we speak of Mary? Well, I think that Mariology offers us a fascinating and interesting pathway to reflect theologically on the gendered aspect of Christian living. Right? Because generally speaking, in Western Christianity, the three persons of the Trinity are referred to and spoken of in male terms, even as we affirm that God doesn't have a gender. We still gender God use it by the pronouns and the language that we use. So Mariology gives us a way to think about how God cares about particular bodies, female bodies, male bodies, and everything in between there. In other words, God cares about particular bodies and everybody. Now, let's get back to discipleship. Christian community, Paul likes to talk about as a in terms, or as a body, right? He likes to offer us this metaphor. And we saw when we looked at discipleship and in the visual devotional that I prepared, how prominent both in the Hebrew Bible and in the Christian Testament this imagery of God knitting us together is. So if we think about Christian community as being a body that is knit together by and through God's grace, one way to express our theological anthropology is through discipleship. As human beings, God's generative and regenerative grace knits us together as new interdependent parts. And because we are interdependent, how we live matters. I want to introduce a new kind of locus, if you will. I mean, it's connected to our theological method, right? So I wanted to find a way of weaving that in here as well. Theological reflection helps us attend to how God is at the center of reality and how we experience God through our particular lives, concerns, and passions. So here, the value of theological reflection, we might describe as the value of religious experience, helps is one more piece. I mean, I could have added this as a way of bridging this gap between us and God, reflecting on how and where we notice God's presence in our lives. The locus prior to theology of religions was theology of culture. Our theology of culture describes our understanding of the intersection of human endeavors and a Christian message of good news, right? How does what we do, the culture we produce as human beings, meet with a Christian message of good news? So that what a theology of culture does is it calls for fostering our theological imagination, as well as developing creative ways to communicate the gospel to the people of our time. So this gets at the contextual aspect of theological speech and theological reflection. So as we now think about theology of religions, in our God Talk about other religions, we're going to be considering how our openness and Christian commitments promote communion with God, as well as neighborliness with other human beings who have religious identities that are different from ours. Okay? So the center of gravity of this particular locus is on how we are neighbors, as how we Christians are neighbors to other humans. So with that, let's turn now to look at a little bit more of the particular content around theology of religions, or what I've, with the tagline here, Christianity among the world's religions. All right, let's define a few important concepts. Of course, we've already reviewed our working definition of theology as our speech about what we understand faith in God to mean. But this raises the question, what does it mean to have a theology of religions, to have God talk about religions? Well, you'll recall from some previous video lectures that I've worked at kind of disarming two loaded terms, religion and secular, or religious and secular. And what I want to do now is return to how we've been thinking about the term religion and reapply it and further nuance it for the conversation that centers around developing a theology of religions. So what I want to highlight here is that religion refers to beliefs that are combined with ritual, social, ethical activities of different kinds that are connected to trust in, belief in some unseen world, a spirit world, or particular deity, or multiple deities. So let's develop this sense or understanding of religion a little more closely. So religion is a belief system that forms the basis of one's worldview. Okay? Religion is expressed through cultural practices, spiritual practices, ethics, and a lifestyle. To maybe summarize it, we could say that religion is a belief system that is expressed through our worldview and our lifestyle. Understanding lifestyle to be a composite of cultural practices, spiritual practices, and ethics. In contrast to religion, I want to describe or define the term faith. Faith refers to two things. One, the actual energy and feeling that animates a belief system, and two, the substantive content of beliefs, such as doctrine and official teachings. Now, most of us live lives as Christians in ways that seek to integrate religion and faith. Okay? So that on the one hand, distinguishing them from each other is complicated and a little bit messy. But let's assume that there is value in figuring out how to distinguish these two things that we tend to try to keep integrated or enmeshed and not separated. So, religion refers to, we might say, some of the lived practices, the external dimensions of being Christian. Faith refers to some of the more internal dimensions of being Christian. So the animating energy that comes with the cultural and spiritual practices and the lifestyle of being Christian. But then it's also the kind of faith is also sort of this intellectual assent that we give to beliefs in the form of doctrine and official teaching. Okay? I want to nuance this a little bit further, or maybe give us another handle by using some images or metaphors or analogies. So I want to suggest that maybe we can think about faith as a stream of water and religion as a pitcher that holds, that we use to sort of dip in, or that holds some of this water, so that we understand maybe faith as being a kind of exuberant, flowing thing that is greater than who we are as individuals, right? And religion being the kind of limited and embodied way that we contain some of the water from this stream. Okay? So again, I want to underscore the fact that for most of us, distinguishing these two things seems really wrong, but it's important to distinguish the two. And hopefully over the course of this lecture series, you'll see a little bit more about why I think that's so. Now, let's move here to defining theology of religions, and I'm working here with Veli-Matti Karkkainen's definition of theology of religions. And I meant to have an animation here that would break this apart, but my slide isn't working that way. So, so this is actually, okay, so in this first sentence, theology of religions is that discipline of theological studies which attempts to account theologically for the meaning and value of other religions. But then there are two other dimensions of theology of religion, or theology of religions, plural. A Christian theology of religions attempts to think theologically about what it means for Christians to live with people of other faiths, A, and B, a Christian theology of religions, attempts to think theologically about the relationship of Christianity to other religions. Okay, so there are kind of three tasks here of a Christian theology of religions, according to Karkinen. First, and oh, now my animations are working. So in other words, we might say that our theology of religions is our speech about the theological meaning and value of other religions. It's also our speech about how we Christians are good neighbors to people of other faiths. And third, it's our speech about Christianity as one among the world's religions. Now, related to all of this, or as I was working on this lecture and outlining these themes, I found myself thinking about these signs. Some of you will be familiar with these, others of you won't. This is a yard sign that was that started being produced by some folks at Emmanuel Mennonite Church in Harrisonburg, Virginia, and they started popping up. I think it was primarily in the wake of or as the 2016 presidential election was ramping up into its final days, and then the outcome happened when Donald Trump was elected. The message of these signs from a group of Christians to their neighbors in their intercultural neighborhood was, as you can see here in the blue, no matter where you're from, we're glad you're our neighbor. And the reverse then is also true. That is, or the no matter where you're from, we're glad we're your neighbor. Okay, it's a two-way exchange. So the signs carried this message, the original signs carried this message here in Spanish, English, and Arabic. Okay, so that there's the Spanish represents the U.S. southern border, and immigration flows from Latin America into the United States. And the Arabic represents the U.S.'s ongoing war on terrorism, which has contributed to a heightened sense of Islamophobia in the United States. Now, since then, this yard sign has been turned into bumper stickers. If you drive around Elkhart County, you can count on seeing these signs every hither and yon, mostly in the yards of Mennonites. I'll just go ahead and be blunt there. But here is another version of the sign that was developed, I think it was somewhere like in Minnesota, Wisconsin, so west and north of here, I believe, that has added some additional languages to the sign as a way of contextualizing the sign and acknowledging large immigrant communities that aren't Spanish speaking or Arabic speaking. But this sign, at least for me, sort of symbolizes this invitation to think theologically about what does it mean for us to be good neighbors as Christians, right? And when I think about and teach out of this content related to theology of religions, it's very important to me to pose the question, how does Jesus make a difference? Now, we could ask the question, does Jesus make a difference, yes or no? But that's not a very interesting question to me. The more interesting question is the question that pushes us to dig and dive a little deeper. Not does Jesus make a difference, because as a Christian, I believe that Jesus does make a difference. The question is how? How in this conversation with other religious traditions, which just a handful of them are referenced here on the screen with the symbols of their traditions. But how does Jesus make a difference, both for us as Christians in our lives of faith, right? And how does Jesus shape the posture with which we enter into conversations with people who have a different set of symbols and loci and beliefs and practices? Okay. Now, sometimes we talk about these points of conversation as interfaith dialogue, and sometimes we talk about it as interreligious dialogue. What's important to understand about the distinction there, that at least I want us to be making in Christian theology too, is that when we enter into interfaith dialogue, we're getting into conversations about the spiritual enlivened experience of being Christian or being Muslim or being pagan or being Taoist or Buddhist, along with a comparative conversation about the various beliefs and doctrines that constitute our faith. When we are in interreligious conversation, there we're getting more into a comparison and contrast of the kinds of norms that are created by our worldview and our belief system, right? So that an interreligious conversation between a Hindu and a Christian and a Buddhist is going to have more to do with what are some of your rituals? What are some of the ways you celebrate special days on the calendar for your tradition, right? Not some of these bigger questions of, well, what deity do you believe in, right? Which is a question that gets more at the faith side of religion, but it's connected. It's very connected, but interfaith dialogue is more interested in some of the content of the beliefs. So what I want us to be thinking about, what I want you to be thinking about, is when we ask this question, how does Jesus make a difference? You can think about it both from an interfaith and an interreligious perspective. How for you does Jesus make a difference in how you relate to people of other beliefs, with other beliefs and faiths and religions, okay? Or to put it in a more grammatically cogent way, how do you as a Christian relate to someone who is Hindu, who is Muslim, who is a secular humanist, who is Jewish? And how does Jesus shape your interaction? The lecture continues with part 2.